Hello readers, I'm the Avid Reader and today we're reviewing Migrations and Cultures written by Thomas Sowell in 1996. So this is the second volume in Thomas Sowell's Culture Trilogy, which is a trilogy of history books by Thomas Sowell, and it's about culture, and it also looks at patterns of how some groups succeed and some fail. So this book specifically is about migrants and how they went around the world. So this book talks about German, Italian, Japanese, Chinese, Jewish, and Indian migrants around the world. And you basically get a history of where these groups immigrated to. It covers their entire history basically, but as this happened mainly in the 19th and 20th century, there's a focus on the last couple hundred years of history relating to this subject for the most part. And this book does have some overlap with Ethnic America by Thomas Sowell relating to German, Japanese, Italian, Chinese and Jewish immigrants to the USA. So I'm gonna talk about these immigration patterns, but I'm gonna skip the US part for these groups. So I'm gonna focus on the other places they went to in the Western Hemisphere and also where they went in the Eastern Hemisphere. So before talking about ethnic groups, Thomas Sowell talks about migration patterns, and he talks about some different things in this introductory chapter, including a bunch about geography. So there are several factors influencing migrant culture, and one of the most influential ones is geography. So the reason that migrants are so different from the host country they go to is often because of geographical factors. So one example you get is mountain people. So people who are from the mountains, from the highlands, they have been where the warrior class has come from in many different wars. So this includes, for example, the Swiss, who were mercenaries during many European wars in the 17th century. So having said that, let's move on to the different migrant groups. Thomas Sowell talks about the different German groups that you've had as migrants. So historically you had Germans in the Baltic region, and although they only represented a small percentage of the Germans in the Russian Empire, they were very much overrepresented in the Russian Empire's military force. So a large proportion of the military and civilian leadership in the Russian Empire in the 19th century were actually Baltic Germans. Then there's the Volga Germans. So these are Germans who immigrated to the Volga region. They did so under a few years under the reign of Catherine the Great, so I think in the 1770s or so. And they got very harsh land to take care of, so they suffered initially, a lot of them died, but they somehow managed to develop that land quite well eventually. And these were de facto colonies, so they had some exemptions initially from Russian laws, so they did not have to do Russian military service initially. However, when you had Russification in the late 19th century, that changed. You also had Germans who migrated to the Black Sea, and this is a much more fertile region, so they prospered better than the Volga Germans. And after the Bolshevik Revolution in the Soviet Union, you had the Germans there who were labeled as kulaks, as they were farmers and relatively prosperous compared to the Russians there. So they ended up being deported to Central Asia. So a lot of Germans ended up in places like Kazakhstan. And this culture, which had remained pure for over a century, was now heavily diluted during World War II and after World War II. So the Volga Germans declined heavily, and now they lost their German culture kind of. And another fact is that the Germans was the second highest emigratory category after the Jews in the Soviet Union. So a lot of Germans immigrated to Germany during the post-war Soviet era, even though they had never lived in Germany before. Here's the thing in general. Italian, Germans, and Japanese are in large part responsible for the development of South America. Then Thomas Sowell talks about the Japanese, and 90% of the Japanese in the Western Hemisphere were either in Brazil or the USA. There was something quite different between Brazil and the USA if you compare the Japanese. So the Japanese in Brazil were in isolated communities. They did not interact that much with the Brazilian community compared to how much they interacted with the American community. So that is why the anti-Japanese policies in Brazil were a lot less harsh than the anti-Japanese policies in the USA during World War II. There wasn't any large-scale internment of Japanese in Brazil during World War II. Then Thomas Sowell talks about the Italians. You have had Italian migrants both in America and in Europe. So a lot of Italians went to France, for example. When France was urbanizing, you had the Italian agricultural workers replacing the French ones. And in South America, Italians did manual labors in Brazil and in Argentina, for example, that the local Brazilians and Argentines disdained. but as the Italians have a culture of saving, they ended up being mildly prosperous in the long run. A lot of Italians are actually sojourners when they went to work. So because of the weird geography in South America, you have Italians who work during one season of the year in Italy, and then in another season they work in South America, and then they return to Italy. Then Thomas Sowell talks about the Chinese. And the Chinese, of course, mostly immigrated to other Asian countries. And here's the thing, these migration patterns happened mostly after the European empires were established. So from around the late 18th century onwards. And the Chinese were heavily urban, so they went to the cities in Southeast Asia. A lot of exports in these Southeast Asian countries, they were developed by Chinese workers. As some of the geography in some of these countries makes it so that you don't have to work that much to produce food, so you only have to work 2-3 days a week, which makes some of these cultures more laid back than the Chinese, so the Chinese worked much harder than the locals when they came to these countries. And the highest proportion of Chinese were in Malaysia, I think about a quarter or a third. And when Malaysia became independent, they started discriminating against the ethnic Chinese through affirmative action policies, for example. And the Chinese and Malaysians didn't really intermarry because Muslims don't marry non-Muslims and the Malaysians are Muslims. And you had the emergence of these Alibaba businesses in places like Malaysia and Indonesia where the official owner is a Muslim and then the real guy who runs things is the Chinese guy to avoid these discriminatory laws. Now Singapore was actually kicked out of Malaysia because otherwise, with Singapore included, Malaysia would actually be plurality Chinese instead of Malay. But Singapore, which is mainly Chinese but has a large minority of Indians and Malays, they set up a system based on equality before the law. So there's personal language rights for the Tamils, for the Chinese, and for the Malays. This equality before the law principle in Singapore has made that the Malays in Singapore are actually richer than the Malays in Malaysia, ironically. The discrimination of the Chinese in Malaysia didn't work to improve the lot of the Malaysians if you compare it to Singapore, where Chinese and Malays are treated equally, and it is true that the Chinese are still wealthier than the Malays, but relatively they're not as wealthy as in Malaysia. And the Malays, objectively in absolute terms, are wealthier in Singapore than in Malaysia. And in Indonesia, you've had a bunch of anti-Chinese riots in the 20th century. The Chinese have controlled large percentages of the economies in Southeast Asia. They have developed industries there that didn't exist prior. And during Pol Pot's democide, he massacred half the Chinese population there. So 200,000 Chinese were killed in Cambodia. And an interesting fact here about government. Chinese Communist government was complaining about the discrimination that the Chinese faced in Indonesia or Malaysia, but they didn't complain with how the Cambodians massacred the Chinese. So governments are quite opportunistic. They don't really care that much about their people in practice. A common trend in this book is that the government, who supposedly represents the interests of their ethnic groups, they don't really. And they often make things worse for their ethnic group within a country, as they create fears of things like fifth colonists. Then Thomas Sowell talks about the Jews, and this is just a general history of the Jews. So he goes back to ancient times up to present day. One thing about history and Jews is that Jews were treated better by pagan Roman emperors than by Christian leaders later on. Jews were treated badly during the Middle Ages by the Christians generally. They were better treated in the Islamic world for the most part during the Middle Ages. And Spain eventually actually expelled the Jews, and they went to work and live in the Ottoman Empire, and they brought the skills that these Jews had to the Ottoman Empire. So the Ottoman Empire initially benefited from the migration of Jews because of their skills. So this included things like military technology and medicine. But the Jews in the Ottoman Empire didn't really keep contact with the Western world. Their importance as a group to bring knowledge to the Ottoman Empire declined and was replaced by Christians like the Greeks and the Armenians. So with some of these ethnic groups, you notice that there's no universal patterns. Like some Jews succeed really well and some don't. This is also true with Indians and with Italians. It depends where they're from and on a multitude of other factors. And one sad fact about the Jews is that there are actually less Jews today than they were prior to World War II. And we know why that is, because of the genocide that occurred during World War II. And before World War II, most Jews lived in Europe. Now most Jews live in Israel or in the United States. And then the final group that Thomas Sowell talks about are the Indians. The Indian subcontinent has many different ethnic groups: Gujaratis, Tamils, Chettiars, to just name a few. And Indian labor was what was largely responsible for building the East African Railway. So a lot of development that occurred in places in East Africa, such as in Kenya and Uganda, happened because of Indian labor. So you can see this pattern of foreigners developing large part of the third world when they migrate there. And a lot of Indians in Uganda and Kenya were shopkeepers, but when Idi Amin came to power in the 70s, he expelled almost all Indians. These guys were replaced by African shopkeepers who were not as efficient business owners as Indian and Pakistani business owners. The Ugandan economy declined after the expelling of Pakistanis and Indians. Kenya didn't really expel the Indians, but they still put pressure on the Indians to leave. So most Indians in Kenya also left. And Indians actually make up a large percentage of the population of Fiji, Guyana, and Trinidad, as they came there as indentured laborers for the most part. So in these countries, they make up something like 30, 40, 50% of the population there. And then in Ceylon or in Sri Lanka, you have the Tamils, who are Indians from Tamil Nadu. And you have two types of Tamils. 2/3 of them are what you call Ceylon Tamils. So they came to Sri Lanka a very long time ago, maybe even before the Sinhalese, Sri Lankans. And then about 1/3 of them are these Indian Tamils, who basically came relatively recently as plantation workers. So the Ceylon Tamils are relatively prosperous, while the Indian Tamils aren't really. But after Sri Lanka's independence, relations between Sinhalese and Tamils went really badly. Eventually it escalated to a civil war. And you have no universal pattern of Indians. If you look at migrants, the Gujaratis tend to be commercial, the Chettiars tend to be moneylenders, a lot of Tamils tend to be plantation labor. Thomas Sowell's final chapter is on culture and history. And one conclusion of this book is basically that disparities is normal. Just because you have a disparity of wealth between two groups, that's not weird because of geographic and cultural factors. Cultural capital is actually one cause of intergroup differences. So in Southeast Asia, for example, the Chinese have a culture of working harder than a lot of other groups there. So that's why they're wealthier overall. The main conclusion of this book, you could basically say, is that expecting equality of outcome between unequal groups in human capital and culture is naive. And that's the book. So how would I rate Migrations and Cultures? I would give it a 9 out of 10. So some of this content is not that new. It's been covered in Ethnic America, but most of the content is new here. And it's very interesting to learn about the histories of different ethnic groups. So I would definitely recommend this book if you want to learn about the migration histories of people like the Indians, the Italians, the Jews, the Chinese, or the Germans. And you can also say this book represents an optimistic story of how you can have social mobility between ethnic groups. So should you read this book? If you're interested in Thomas Sowell or in history of immigrants overall, then definitely I will recommend Migrations and Cultures. If you enjoyed this book review, I would recommend my book review of Ethnic America by Thomas Sowell, which talks about different immigrant groups in the USA specifically. Anyways, I'm the avid reader, and I will see readers next time.